May I speak in the name of the living God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. The phrase, "do not be afraid," or its equivalent, is found over 300 times in the Bible, and it's a central theme in today's Gospel passage. We first encounter fear in the Bible in Genesis chapter 3, when the man and the woman have taken a bite from the fruit from the tree of knowledge, and then they hide from God because they were afraid. Afraid of what they have discovered, afraid of how God would react to their disobedience. There are many things in our lives and in the world of which we may well find ourselves afraid, especially in these troubling times. COVID-19, our own health, and the danger it poses to us and to our loved ones. The unknown, changes in our lives and in society. What will happen to our jobs and our businesses? How we will handle childcare and schooling. The impact on our children and their education. Financial struggles. So too, as the Black Lives Matter protests continue across the world, perhaps we live in fear of discrimination or prejudice, of injustice or inequality. Perhaps we are fearful of the violence that sometimes accompanies such impassioned protests, or the retaliation that they can trigger. And climate change, perhaps somewhat forgotten in these times of COVID-19, and yet something that will also impact the whole world and all of our lives. We will all have our fears and anxieties. Some we will struggle on with on a day-to-day basis. Others will creep up on us just every so often. In today's Gospel passage, Jesus prepares his disciples for what will follow, looking forward to the early church and the spread of the Gospel. He makes it clear to them that life will not be easy, but his overarching message echoes that found throughout the Bible. Do not be afraid. Jesus warns the disciples that although the gospel message is one of peace and love, actually this message will bring conflict and division. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword, he says. The gospel message is not always well received, and in some places and situations it can cause divisions between friends and between families. It is surprisingly controversial to stand up for love and peace, as Jesus himself discovered. We have seen this demonstrated over the last few weeks in the Black Lives Matter protest, in these marches happening across the world. It takes strength and courage to stand up against injustice and inequality, and this may in turn lead to conflict and violence. Years ago, Martin Luther King said, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." Sometimes it is easier and more comfortable to sit back and do nothing. But then injustices will remain. They remain unchallenged, and wrongs are not righted. The disciples did not have the option of sitting back and doing nothing. They had good news to spread, and it would not be easy, Jesus warned them. It was important that they were aware of this, and not entering into the Christian life with any expectation that following Jesus would mean everything would be plain sailing. Surely the disciples only needed to look at Jesus' own life to know the way in which the gospel might be preached and also received. Today's passage from Matthew chapter 10 is the first time that the cross is mentioned in the gospel, when Jesus says, "Whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me." The disciples were called to follow in Jesus' footsteps, to follow his example. And unfortunately, that meant that as they grew to be more Christ-like, imitating what Jesus said and did, they would also experience rejection as he did, and suffer. As Jesus said, a disciple is not above the teacher, nor a slave above the master. As he suffered, so would they. But as Bonhoeffer suggested, suffering is not seen by Jesus as a good thing. In no way did Jesus amble up boldly to the cross that awaited him. Rather, suffering is seen as an evil which will be experienced. And yet Jesus encourages his followers to recognize the limits with which suffering and evil can threaten us. Ultimately, they cannot overcome us. As we read in Romans chapter 8, they cannot separate us from the love of God. "Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul," says Jesus, reminding us who holds the real power. We too are called, as the disciples were, to become more like Jesus. As C.S. Lewis claimed, the church exists for nothing else but to draw people into Christ, to make them little Christs. Our challenge is then, in a time and society in which we are not called to suffer imprisonment and martyrdom as Jesus' first followers were, our challenge is, will we still recognise Jesus in the world and in the end times, because his wounds match our own? We are still called to live a sacrificial life, following Jesus' example. What might this look like in today's society, I wonder? All of this from Jesus may not sound like much of an encouragement, as Jesus prepares his disciples for what will follow. There will be conflict and division. Be prepared. You will suffer. Just look at me, says Jesus. Where is the encouragement and the good news, we might wonder? Well, we return to the message I began with. We are encouraged not to be afraid. And one reason is that the powers held by this world is something of an illusion. Yes, distressingly, they can hurt the body. Those persecutors of the church can threaten, imprison, and even put to death those professing faith in Jesus. So too, we live in a world where people are treated unjustly and unfairly, where deadly viruses bring death and grief. And yet, Jesus reminds us, God is the one who keeps our very being, our spirit, our soul, our life. And this God, most importantly of all, cares for all of us. This is Jesus' greatest reassurance, I think, that God cares for each one of us. Let's just hear those verses once more. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. And even the hairs of your head are all counted. So do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows. Anyone who saw Springwatch this year will no doubt relate somewhat to this passage. Over several weeks we glimpsed the incredible way in which nature reproduces. We see its vulnerability, how precarious life is. It can be heart-wrenching to follow the journey of birds, building a nest, laying eggs, watching their chicks hatch and then feed them, only for one or more of the chicks to die, or cruelly get taken or eaten by a predator. One nest that caught my eye this year was the blackcaps, where sadly the mother died during the night while still providing for the chicks, leaving Dad to feed them by himself. But incredibly, the chicks all fledged the next day. In some ways, our lives too can feel precarious, especially in light of a pandemic, and that can be very frightening. But Jesus reminds us of just how much we are loved and valued by God and cared for. Nothing can separate us from the love of God, and God wraps his arms of love around us, even in our times of greatest fear. So, as Jesus prepares his disciples for all that will follow, there are 3 important messages for us too. Be prepared that Christian life will not always be plain sailing and may well lead to conflict and hardship. Look to Jesus as our example and be aware that his life was one of great sacrifice and suffering. And finally, know your value before God and that you are loved. Amen.